Hey friends, fam. Well, as promised, I'm going to try to give you guys some gardening tips on growing in, it's bright out here, growing in different areas with small space, or those that don't want to dig in the ground or don't have the room. But anyway, first let me just say I hope everybody's doing okay during our crisis mode. And I just pray that God blesses and keeps each and every one of you. So let me take the camera off myself. I'm camera shy. And I'm going to turn it over to the stars of the show. And that's the vegetable plants. So let's see here if I can do this and operate a camera and do this at the same time. It might be a little tricky. Anyway, we're gonna talk about container gardeners. Okay. A lot of people think they can't have a garden or grow their own fruits and vegetables because they don't have room. And I'm just going to dispel that myth for you right now, here today, because just about anything you grow in the ground, you can also grow in a container. Um, so just depending on what you want to grow, if you just want to grow some things like herbs and spices, you don't need huge containers. But the bigger the container, the better, because it's going to give you a lot more growth and room for your plants to grow. But just for me, I like to grow things that I know I like to eat. And so for those of you that have never garden before, probably the easiest thing in the world to start with would be something like herbs. So just let me introduce you to a couple of my favorites and that are very easy. And by the way, for those that ask me about heat resistant or heat tolerant plants, most of the plants that I'm going to show you today are drought tolerant and heat tolerant. So you don't have to worry about that if you live in a real dry or hot climate. I'm going to show you a few little tricks and the types of plants that do pretty well. So first, let me say, these are some herbs, ones I like. This is some Greek oregano. We've got some sage. We've got one of my favorites, rosemary. And that rosemary will grow into a huge bush if you plant it in the ground or in a large pot. We got some scallions. My cilantro is a little droopy because she's about hot as I am right now. And some basil, sweet basil. Those are just some of the, oh, an onion. Those are just some of the spices that I like to grow. I also grow peppermint. Those are in the ground right now, but peppermint and things like chocolate mint. A lot of these plants, like most of your herbs, are going to be perennial plants, meaning that they'll come back every year. You don't have to necessarily repot or replant them if they, do well throughout the year. Most of them are going to come back. Most of your herbs will. Your peppermint definitely will. Matter of fact, that'll take over. And then some, of course, you'd have to plant or replant annually. So just a few of my favorites that I like to grow for me. Um, Cantaloupe. And these cantaloupe, even though they grow on a vine, same thing for watermelon. You can still start them in pots as long as you leave them room to spread out. Once the vines start growing outside of the pot, you want them to have some room. So if you don't have room, probably that's not the best choice. But one of the easiest things to grow in pots, and one of my favorite, is spinach. Um, you can grow that in a pot very easily. They do very well. As a matter of fact, a lot of times when you grow things like some of the things that you grow in pot will actually produce more than if you were to put it in the ground, because the roots don't have that far to spread and go. I got these from a company called Bonnie Plants. Um, Now I know that Bonnie is they have a whole nursery here. I don't know if they're where you are, but usually I see their plants in so many different places. But if not Bonnie, there are some other plants. They do have an organic division. So if you're starting from plants and not seeds, then that's a good option. You can go to Lowe's, you can go to Walmart, if you want to start from plants. We'll talk about starting from seeds later, but since it's kind of um, planting time, I usually plant around Good Friday. Um, it's just something that I do. It's the season here allows me to plant, earlier or later, but Good Friday is kind of a spiritual thing for me. So I like to plant on Good Friday, and like I said, but most of these you're gonna be able to grow right in pots. This is some purple cabbage or red cabbage. It looks purple when it's growing. That's why I call it purple, but it's actually red cabbage. That grows really good in pots or in the ground. And what I'm going to do with them this year, they look like big, huge flowers when they grow. So I'm going to actually be planting some in my yard just for some edible landscaping. The next thing we have here is some nice lettuce, some red lettuce, or it will be. Um, that grows nicely in pots. We've got some Swiss rainbow chard. That grows nicely in pots. The cabbage, the chard, the spinach are all pretty drought tolerant, and they don't require a whole bunch of water. You'd think they would, but they really don't. Not as much as some things. Same things with like watermelon. People think because it's watermelon it requires a lot of water, and it really doesn't. They're pretty heat tolerant. Now, if you live someplace that's super hot, like Alabama, or I think Diane, you're in Maryland or somewhere like that, then you know especially if you're growing in pots, you're gonna water at least twice a day anyway. So, oh, this is some red romaine lettuce, and that grows nicely in pots. Um, one of the other things I love are my bell peppers. This is some jalapeno pepper. If you like, you want to always make sure you got something hot and spicy. This is some cucumber, and cucumbers grow really nicely in pots. Um, they like to trellis, so they'll grow up. So if you put them in a nice sized pot and then maybe give them something to trellis up, they'll grow up and you'll have a real good bounty. These are a couple of different types of tomatoes. I got cherry tomatoes and I got big boy tomatoes. So if you're growing in pots, the big boys might be a little heavy once they mature. Those do a little better in the ground unless you got a really big pot and you can stake them up or put a gate around them. The cherry tomatoes do really good in pots because they're small and they're not too heavy, and they just keep producing for a long time. And same thing for pole beans, string or snap beans. You can grow these in pots, and they will trellis up a pole. So if you put those in a pot and you put a nice sturdy um, apparatus for them to trellis on, I mean, you can use just about anything, bamboo sticks, heck, broomsticks. It doesn't matter. Just get creative because I don't want to really send anybody out shopping for anything that you don't have to go out for. So if you don't have plants and you want to start with seeds, then that's going to be an option too. And we'll go over that a little later. So for now, with the plants that I have now, like I said, your herbs, your tomatoes, lettuce, onions, basil, all of these can be grown in pots. And there's really nothing more, I guess, satisfying than to grow something and then produce the fruit and eat it. And these are things that God gave us. You know, He said that I think one of the first, or the first commission that God gave man was tending the garden. And He said that He's given us the seed, and the fruit is in the seed, and we're to use it for our food. So myself, I'm trying to go over to a little bit more plant-based diet, just because I don't want to go shopping for meat, even though I've got some farmers around here, and they um, raise like grain, or grass fed beef and things like that. I'm really trying to get away from meat altogether, so hopefully this year I'll be successful. I'm a chicken person, kind of losing my taste for fish, but I don't want to kill my chicken. I just use her for eggs. Anyway, growing in pots. So, first thing, if you're going to grow in pots, you want to first determine what you want to grow. If it's something like tomatoes, you know you're going to need a really nice sized pot. Something like lettuce, like this, you can use just about any size, really. And the bigger the pot, of course, the bigger your head's going to be. But the thing with lettuce is once it grows from one lettuce or from one head, it's going to produce about 4 or 5 times for you. So once you harvest the leaves, and we'll get into that when harvest time comes, but once you harvest the leaves off, it's gonna reproduce, uh, between 3 and 5 more times. So you're gonna get um, like 3 or 4 heads from one leaf of lettuce. And this looks like one, but this is actually one, two, this is actually 6 plants here. So let's look at the economics of that. If you were to go into a grocery store and buy a head of lettuce, or a um, a bell pepper, we know how expensive red bell pepper is. Okay, so it's almost $2 for one pepper, if at least what I've seen. But say you just had one of these plants. This is 6 plants. Well, I've already planted one, but say if you just had one of these plants, and it's going to produce um, dozens of bell peppers for you. And so if you bought a pack of seeds for a couple of dollars, and that pack of seeds has, I don't know, some 30, depending on the size you buy, a half a pound or half ounce, whatever, but you're going to get hundreds of bell peppers for $1 rather than one. So that's the economics part. Same thing with your herbs and your rosemary. I don't know if you go in a grocery store and you see a little piece of rosemary for about $3, and you can grow your own for less than $1, or at least, no more than $3 if you buy a plant. But if you start it with seeds and things like that, then you're spending a couple of dollars, and you're producing hundreds of dollars worth of food, actually. So to me, that's sexy if you can feed your family off a couple of dollars. I don't know about y'all, but anyway, growing in a pot. So the thing about potting, that's different from growing in the ground, is number one, the soil. With potting, you want to use something that's lighter and not as heavy as like the soil that you might have in your garden. You don't want to bring that in, because you end up with weeds and probably insects and things like that you want to avoid. But if you're growing in pots, then you need more like a soilless base. And by soilless, I mean you want to mix something like some peat moss, maybe some sand, um, and they've got the potting soil, so and that's not real heavy, but you don't want it so dense that it's going to smother your roots. So either you want to start with something soilless like that, or you want to have some compost. Now, this is my compost, but it's been developing for a while. So that's not it. It takes I think, 4 to 6 weeks to really break down. And compost is just a lot of organic matter broken down at the end of every year. Take all the old plants and some dried leaves, green stuff, brown stuff. You can throw leftover foods in there, like your uh, if you got some salad left over or something like that. Some things you don't want to put, but most things you can put right in your compost bin, and it'll all break down, and it just makes a really really rich soil for you. So I do the compost, and then I add a little food in there for feeding it. But if you have a compost, and I think you can buy it in bags too, then you don't necessarily have to have the soilless products, the peat moss. But if you want to keep your pots nice and light, and you want to be able to transport them and move them around, you want to keep your roots from smothering, and it's best to do your potting with a soilless base, and then you're going to be adding liquid fertilizer to feed the plants. So while I'm on that, let's talk about the three things that all plants need, just like us. It's three things: food, water, and light. So food, water, and your sunlight. Your food is going to come from your soil, or if you're using soilless, it's going to come from a liquid fertilizer that you can buy. Or if you know somebody, with a big fish tank, you can use the fish emulsion, or you could use, well, you probably couldn't use it maybe where you are, but it's called manure tea. And it's just making kind of a tea by soaking some either cow, or I have horses, so horse manure. So all of that's kind of in my compost, broken down leaves and wood chips and a little bit of poop in there, some of everything, but it makes it really rich. Other than that, if you're starting with the soilless, then you want to put some um, gravel, either some coarse gravel or some, you know, get away, doggy, or some loose rocks. And then on top of that, you also want to add something like, straw. What this is going to do is give it air. You can use wood chips. And like I said, the peat moss is going to give your roots air and allow them to breathe and not smother. And that if you use wood chips or something like the straw, the peat moss, all that's going to retain moisture for you too. So you don't have to worry about the plants drying out. Now, those of you that said you're in drought conditions or drought areas, a couple of tricks that you can do is in the potting itself. I would probably add a nice maybe 1.5 inch of wood chips. Moisten those real good before you pot, and or before you plant and put everything in the pot. Um, and as you water, that the wood chips are going to retain a lot of moisture for you. So that's one trick that you can do. Also, if you're in a really hot place, you can kind of double pot, meaning that you can take a pot maybe this size and sit another pot inside of it. Fill in the spaces with maybe some newspaper or again some moss, and that's going to give it some insulation from the heat. So that's another trick for drought resistant areas is how you pot and the type of pot that you use. I know that the clay and like the terracotta pots are really pretty. They're heavy, but they're pretty. But I prefer something like the plastic ones because they retain moisture better. So if you're in a drought, um, you know, uh, area that has a lot of heat and a lot of dryness, then just use a plastic pot because that's going to retain the moisture for you, and it's going to give you, a longer growing time, especially if you're in a heat or cool resistance, because the insulation works both ways. It'll keep the plants warm, and it'll keep them from getting too hot also. So I don't know how I'm going to do this with one hand in my camera. I need a cameraman, I guess. But what I wanted to do was go ahead. I'll just go ahead and do this one. I could do this with one hand, and I'm gonna put a tomato plant, I think, in here. I'm not sure yet. Um, Maybe not tomato, because it's gonna be pretty deep. But you just want to get your base in, and you want to fill your pot. The thing about tomato plants, there's a saying about tomatoes, is you don't plant a tomato, you bury a tomato. So when you get that tomato plant in there, you want to actually bury it like up to almost the last leaf. And what that's going to do is produce nice strong stems and stalks for you, so that when your fruit starts to bear, it won't just collapse on itself and bend all over. So let's see if that's enough in here for one of these tomato plants. And like I said, this is about 6 plants. Yeah, this is about 6 plants here. I'm going to do the cherry tomato, because I'm going to be putting those better boys in the ground. So here we have a nice little tomato plant. Oops. Isn't she cute? So she's very pretty. You can see the roots. And they're pretty hardy. I mean, tomatoes are really about one of the easiest things to grow other than the herbs. So let's see if I could do this with one hand, since so I'm getting kind of down in there. And you see, I'm going to actually bury her up to these last leaves here. So I'm going to put some more compost in. And then you want to leave a little room, because you want to be able to add some compost later for food. So if you see how far down I've buried that tomato, I didn't leave the stem sticking out or anything like that. And you just want to kind of give her a little support. Support it a little. And that's about it. This tomato, when she starts to grow, when she gets maybe about 2 feet, then you'll start to stake it, give it some extra support. And that's about it. Now in a pot like this, you can grow a nice head of cabbage, some lettuce. You can use pots like this, and I use these. I'll put maybe 2 heads of lettuce in there. You could probably get 3 in there, but if you put 2, they'll get nice and big. So you can use your long pots. You can use your, I think this is a 2-gallon. I think it's 2-gallon. For something bigger, if you want like really big tomatoes, use something even like a trash barrel like this thing here. I use it for compost, but you could grow something in there easily. You can grow more than one plant in the same pot. If the pot is big enough, you could grow maybe 3 plants, 3 different plants. Something like you could take your pole bangs or your snap bangs. I like to say, if you're going to do the 3-tier, do it in 3s. So you have a tall plant that's going to grow tall like your beans. And then you have maybe a low growing plant like your spinach, or some of your Swiss chard, things that stay pretty low. Um, And then you can have your root vegetables like carrots or beets. So if you're gonna grow everything in one pot, you wanna go tall, small, and roots. So while and you also want to grow things together that require about the same amount of watering. So you don't overwater one thing and underwater another. And when you buy plants or even seeds, they come with instructions on how much sun, how much water they need. And then you just want to modify that to where you live, because a lot of these plants say 6 to 8 hours. Oh, let me see. Let me take this cilantro, for example, since it's wilting. It says 3 to 6 hours of partial shade. So when this was sitting in the shade, I just brought them all out to set them up here for you guys to be able to see. She was standing up. So you can see this doesn't like a lot of sun. So I'm going to put her back over here in her shade. Put it back in the shaded area, because it just doesn't like a lot of sun. Most of your greens don't like a lot of sun. They want partial shade. Same thing with lettuce. You don't want them to get too hot. Your cabbage, your chard, um, spinach, lettuce, all those things grow really well in partial shade. If you live in a hot area, just give them partial shade anyway, which is mostly what I do. But most of these will grow good in partial shade. Your tomatoes might need a little bit more sun. Your herbs grow well in partial shade. So don't let the heat beat you. Don't let the sun beat you. If you live in a really sunny area, just give your plants partial shade anyway. They'll get plenty of sun. Even sitting in the shade, they're going to get enough light. So I think I'm going to cut it off for now, for today, and see how this goes. If you guys want some more tips or some more lessons, just let me know. I think I'm going to try to do this online as a what do you call it, a watch party or something, and see how that goes, because I'm not that technical about videography. So hopefully this turned out okay. You guys got some info, and that way, while we watch the video, I could take some questions, because I'm sure I forgot some things, and I'm sure you guys might have some questions that I forgot to cover or didn't cover. So in the meantime, be creative. You can grow in just about anything. Like this was a barbecue pit, and I just use it kind of like a planetarium now, especially in the wintertime, because the bricks stay warm a long time after the sun goes down. And but you can use just about anything for a container. I know one lady, she has an old sailboat in her backyard. I'm gonna try to find those pictures, and it's beautiful. She used a boat, and she just grows in the boat. It's beautiful. But things like barrels, especially if you know somebody with some old wine barrels, those are wonderful, and they are very expensive. So if you know anywhere you can get your hands on, I'd get them if I were you, if somebody's giving them away. Um, you can grow in tubs. Anything that you grow in, you want to make sure it has a good drainage system in the bottom. You want to make sure there's holes in the bottom, or else you'll just have to make some holes. So you can get the big storage bins from like the dollar store, and just punch you some holes in the bottom of it. Make sure that you got a good drainage system going, and growing that. So maybe two of those would probably grow um, probably 5 or 6 varieties of vegetables for you. So, um, yeah. So hopefully you got a little bit of advice, and I will see you guys later on Facebook.